another episode of Minor Issues, a mini podcast from the Mises Institute. There's a lot of talk of inflation these days and how bad it is. And we certainly know how bad it is in terms of our purchasing power and how far our paycheck goes and the things that we've had to give up as a result of ever increasing prices in the economy. But most people don't understand how bad things can get and all of the various aspects of the negative effects of monetary inflation on the economy. Today's episode is going to focus on how bad can it get. Basically, the Fed is telling us a story that inflation is falling, it's low, it's declining. But Austrian economists warn that inflation can go much higher based on the ideas and thinking of central bank policymakers at the Federal Reserve. Today's Wall Street Journal has a story on the front cover. It's kind of fun reading for Wall Street Journal readers. It's called, "If a $100 trillion bill doesn't work, how about some cheese?" And what they're talking about in this article is the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in Africa, where the $100 trillion bill wasn't really worth very much because inflation had gotten so very high. In 2008, the inflation rate rose from 100,000% in a month to over 1,000,000% a couple of months later, and 250,000,000% a couple of months after that. It was at this point, after the government or the central bank in Zimbabwe created a hyperinflation, that they decided to switch from their own currency to the US dollar, which is considered, or has been considered, a relatively sound currency through the years. And as soon as they adopted the dollar, yes, inflation did fall, obviously because people were using dollars, and people in Zimbabwe would take their earnings in Zimbabwe dollars, they would take their paycheck, and they would immediately withdraw the whole thing in terms of US dollars out of their own bank and put it in the NMB bank, which they sort of jokingly refer to as the National Mattress Bank. So nobody trusted the banks, nobody trusted the government because of the cruel hyperinflation that they had imposed on the people. So you have a situation where they suffered through hyperinflation, they switched to the dollar, but now they have a problem of no change in Zimbabwe. They would import dollars and other currencies, but they never imported coins denominated in US dollars. So they didn't have pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters to make change. And so this imposed a severe problem on the economy. Businesses wanted to use dollars, they wanted to accept dollars, many of them wouldn't accept the old Zimbabwe dollars, but they didn't have anything to offer their customers in terms of change. And so the businesses, the gas stations, the restaurants, and so forth would issue their own personal IOUs, or they would offer in restaurants to customers extra containers of sauce. And some restaurants and convenience stores would actually offer slices of cheese and hard-boiled eggs instead of change proper. And, you know, I love hard-boiled eggs, but I would be quite surprised if that's what I got in change from a normal transaction. And of course, not everybody likes hard-boiled eggs or slices of cheese. And the Wall Street Journal article looks at an interview they did with somebody from Zimbabwe who was receiving these paper IOUs in change from making purchases. And she had the trouble of, you know, just sticking the IOU in your pocket and then finding it a week later in the daily laundry, all crumpled up and erased as a result of the washing process. So, you know, this is how bad inflation can get. This is how it can directly impact your circumstances in your day-to-day lives. And so when we emphasize on this program the difficulties of inflation, we're trying to highlight some of the difficulties that producers and entrepreneurs face, but ultimately it has an impact on everyday ordinary consumers that we're most concerned about, and which the central bank, the federal government, the national government, the president, they don't really have any concern with that. They fully support the monetary policy regime that has been printing up zillions of dollars and leading to very high rates of inflation in the United States. But today's episode points out that things still can get much worse.
Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here are your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. I am one of your standard hosts, Bob Murphy. Jeff can't be with us this week, but he will be back next week. We do have, though, for your listening pleasure, Peter St. Onge with us. Peter, how's it going?
It is going great, Bob. Thanks.
So I wanted to have you on because you've been just tweeting up a storm, parlaying some of your YouTube videos on all the banking stuff. So we have a few topics I want to hit, but one in particular that struck me that was interesting that I hadn't seen other people reporting on it, but I saw it from you, was the fact that the head of Silicon Valley Bank was not just a regular banker, he was also tied in with the Fed. So can you talk a little bit about that?
That's pretty astounding. So he was one of the 9 directors of the San Francisco Fed, which is the regional Fed that in theory is regulating and monitoring, supervising Silicon Valley Bank. And of course, when Silicon Valley Bank failed, the first response of the regulators was to scapegoat and try to figure out, who did what. And the irony there is the malfeasance here, the person person who caused this, the CEO of the bank itself, is actually one of them. So, sort of the, I can't believe there's gambling going on here.
Let me read a little bit, because this is nothing new, in case people are astounded that this happened. So one of the things back when the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme was unveiled, and that was a big deal for what I did some research into that. And so one element of that story that I didn't hear a lot of people picking up was that Madoff himself was connected to the SEC, and in fact, there were private watchdog groups that were for years, in some cases, sending warnings to the SEC, the various regulatory bodies, saying, "Hey, I've been looking at this Madoff enterprise, and these numbers just don't make any sense. This has to be I don't know if they said it has to be a Ponzi scheme, but they were saying these numbers don't make any sense. This can't be right. You need to look into this." And the warnings were ignored for years. Okay, I'm reading just from a Fortune article on this. After the Bernie Madoff thing broke, it says, "For years, Madoff was a bright star in the SEC's constellation, a legendary investment manager with celebrity clients, as well as multitudes of ordinary investors. He was chairman of the NASDAQ stock market in 1990, 91, and 93, and he sat on SEC advisory committees." Now, in this Fortune article, they don't say this, but I vaguely recall at the time that it wasn't really that Madoff was on various committees generically, but specifically, at least one of them had to do with ethical conduct on financial markets. So that it was really a case of the fox guarding the hen house. Let's see. Then Congress brought that was the question posed in Washington after Madoff was arrested and confessed. Blah blah blah. Top SEC officials were hauled before Congress. The agency's enforcement inspection staff had received credible complaints about Madoff, including specific red flags on his operations from financial analyst whistleblower Harry Markopoulos and his investigators, which were conveyed to SEC staff in Boston, New York, and Washington, and so forth. Okay, so again, it's when it comes to people talk about, we don't know, we need to have stricter regulation, and Elizabeth Warren has been going off about what SVP did. And my joke was, is she going to enforce 100% reserve banking? What specifically are they going to do, in light of this? But with the Madoff thing, yeah, it was literally the private sector was onto him first and was warning the government regulators, and they ignored it, partly because Madoff himself was sitting on some of those boards.
Right, and if you are a professional cat burglar, you would very much like to be on the government regulator of burglary, of who gets to enter houses, right? So it is a very attractive target for any scammer. I mean, really, if you're good at your job, the first thing you're going to do is try to infiltrate those kinds of ethic boards and any kind of oversight committee. The profits are enormous, right? Because the other scammer competition is shut out, and you've got this privileged access. So I think it should concern people. There's kind of a wider question. Our government places administrative independence on a pedestal, right? Independent central banking, independent regulators, ethics, and so on. And one might ask the question, if that independence means that these regulators and these functions are isolated from the rest of the government, by the way, isolated from the people who allegedly run the country, are you sort of creating this closed box where you've got these contacts and circulation, kind of a revolving door and golden parachutes in their little world, so that it becomes a sort of crony universe that we the people have no influence over?
Yeah, and I'm glad you used that phrase, the revolving door. I'm sure people have heard that.
It's on a pedestal, right? Independent central banking, independent regulators, ethics, and so on. And one might ask the question, if that independence means that these regulators and these functions are isolated from the rest of the government, by the way, isolated from the people who allegedly run the country, are you sort of creating this closed box where you've got these contacts and circulation, kind of a revolving door and golden parachutes in their little world, so that it becomes a sort of crony universe that we the people have no influence over?
Yeah, and I'm glad you used that phrase, the revolving door. I'm sure people have heard that. In case people have heard it, they actually never had someone spell it. The idea is that people in industry, they serve there, they get time in industry, then they go, when they retire, then they go to public service, and they go in the various regulatory bodies that oversee the industries they used to be a part of. And the concern is whether it's completely cynical and they do it knowing full what's going on, or whether it's merely just, hey, those people, they're your buddies, and you remember what it was like to be running a bank, or or to run a car company, and geez, it's really a tough job, and now that I'm in the regulatory seat, let me try to look out for those guys. And so, but the idea being that you're going to be beholden to them and do favors, and then also too, the way it works in practice, it's not as naked as somebody funneling money to a Swiss bank account or something to the person while they're sitting on the CFTC or whatever. It's just that they know if I play ball, if I'm a team player or whatnot, then when I step down from that role, I might get a cushy consulting position, as the elder statesman, and I've been in the industry for 30 years and then out of government service, and now I have this cushy job where I write a blog post once a week and get paid $200,000 a year, that sort of thing. So it's a very old boys network kind of arrangement. But also, it's when people say, oh well, we need to fix it, it would be tricky, given that the federal government is going to come in and regulate these industries or these financial sectors or whatnot. The solution is not to say, okay, well then no one with any industry experience can have any input in what we do. Exactly. Because then it's complete chaos. To give an example, it was, so in case people don't know, there's these things when the government announces some new rule, proposed rulemaking or whatever their jargon is, then there's a comment period, industry, whatever, lobby groups weigh in on it. And again, that's not merely just groups vying for their share of the pie. In some cases, it really is the case that the proposed regulations are crazy. They literally contradict some other regulation, and somebody has to come forward and say, you guys can't do that. So an example would be with the ethanol regulations that were put in place under the George W. Bush, that free market, laissez-faire, radical anarchist George W. Bush. One of the things that his administration put through were ethanol required that you had to blend in more ethanol into the fuel mix. And the way that the regulations, it wasn't a percentage, it was just, there was a staircase of absolute amounts. And so then when the Great Recession hit, and driving, well, it wasn't driving, but fuel consumption went down, I think, because of trucking and stuff. All of a sudden, the percentage of ethanol in the fuel mix was going to be so high, it was going to violate some other rule about that was going to mess up people's engines. And so, so they were getting exemptions. Every year they had to, do another exemption or something because this is the regulation as stated. Would have been insane. But so the problem, it's top down. There's no right way for the government to kind of run an economy.
No, you're absolutely right. And once you give government control of a function, like once you are giving government the ability to completely determine all of the rules, all of the capital flows in our financial system, the only way to do that and not break it is to bring in insiders. And then the question is, well, once you bring insiders, does that inevitably lead to the fox guarding the hen house, so regulatory capture? And if we look in finance, yes, it appears to. The second issue, Bob, is something that you mentioned, is the the regulations contradicting each other. And this is a bit like if you go to the doctor, and if you are taking 100 different prescription medicines, you better have a good doctor, because that doctor has to figure out which ones contradict, which ones interact, which ones are going to kill you. And we have an economy today that has so many, literally nobody knows how many regulations there are, right? Every year you've got these various attempts by Mercatus and different outfits that try to tally up the regulations. Literally they go by page count, because nobody has the vaguest concept how many regulations, essentially how many laws companies have to be following. So it's not even 100 medicines that you're on. These are tens of thousands of medicines. So not only do you need that expertise, in fact, the point where you're dealing with such a small number of people that, yes, there's no chance of regulatory capture. They're all going to know each other. They're going to work for each other. They're going to work for each other in future. But in addition to that, you have no idea what kind of deadly outcomes are going to come from those interactions. So I mean, it's to the point where even if you bring in a bunch of PhDs who try to determine what are the unintended consequences, what are the perverse incentives, if you're talking millions of pages of rules, that we don't have humans that good yet. We won't for a while yet.
Right. And another famous example of that was when Hank Paulson was, in government when the financial crisis hit and the fateful decision to let Lehman go down. A lot of people were saying, well, gee, I wonder if that's because, he had been a rival of them, when he was in the private sector. Who knows? But it's hard. Again, even if it's not purely cynical, it's hard for people. That's why, judges have to recuse themselves if their the guy's daughter's on trial or something. He can't be the judge in that case. Things like that. So I suppose, why don't we just instead of just moving on, we just complained about a bunch of stuff. What would, and I know we have other things we want to get into, but just to not leave people hanging there. So are we just whining and bellyaching, or how could there be quote regulation of the financial sector if we don't have an SEC running it or a CFTC and so forth?
Oh, my idea, I think yours as well, would just be to get rid of all of the regulations and go to a liability-based system. This is largely what we had in the Lochner era before the progressives destroyed our economy. And so the idea was you can pretty much do what you want because economic rights are fundamental human rights. And if you hurt somebody, right, if you are negligent or if you cause some harm to somebody else, then of course they can take you in court. It was much easier to do that because the Lawyers Guild had not yet captured the legal system. And so that meant that potential evildoers, companies who are making unsafe products or whatever, they would be forced to include the damage to consumers. Okay, they would be forced to include that in the price of the item, and so this is economically extremely efficient. But another side benefit, of course, is that you just get rid of the entire regulatory state. You would go back to a liability basis, based on common law, based on very, very simple, easy to understand rules that make sense to the general public and that are understandable for companies, so they can actually guess what's right and what's wrong based on common sense, not based on having to hire lawyers for $1 million to read through thousands of regulations.
Yeah, definitely. And too, I think people need to remember that if the choice isn't regulation or not, it's regulation from the top down and from political institutions, where if something goes wrong, they get more funding, right? So the SEC completely fumbled the ball on Bernie Madoff. It's not that they had their budget cut in half and they had to have massive layoffs. Oh, we need to beef up the SEC. Clearly, they're understaffed, right? Or if a plane crashes, not because of some freak event, but because the inspectors from the FAA were caught smoking dope behind the shed or something, instead of doing what you're supposed to do. It's not that the SEC or the FAA loses funding; it actually gets more funding, right? Because clearly it's an antiquated system. We've been starving them for fun. So it's not surprising that those systems, those oversight bodies, don't work very well when the incentives are that messed up. It's almost like you're just relying on the basic decency of humans to do the right thing, even though the incentives are the opposite. And then where in the world do you want to not rely on human decency? It's at the level of federal government bureaucracies up there. But you can have private watchdog groups. Again, Harry Martin, he was the one who was flagging Madoff. So he wasn't just doing that as a hobby. That was like his business. He was an analyst who gave reports to subscribers and things, and he was just warning his people on his newsletter how he did it, saying, hey, I'd steer clear of this Madoff guy, and then he just, as a good citizen, passed some of that stuff up the chain. So yes, consumer reports thing. You want to go buy a new car? There's plenty of private groups that evaluate that, all sorts of information, especially now with the internet. So it's easy. And again, I would just caution people to not just assume, have all that stuff, but really, to really make sure the job gets done, you got to have Washington D.C. in charge of it. What more would they have to do to show that no, that's not a good strategy?
Well, you're absolutely right. If you look at FTX and really across crypto, people in crypto, A, there's a lot of them who are extraordinarily smart. B, they are very, very vigilant, very passionate, enthusiastic. People knew FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, was shady years ago. There's concerns about Tether or Binance, like any company that could be shady. There's an entire industry of people who go and look after these. CoffeeZilla, for example, is one on YouTube. He's great. He kind of goes through. He says, does this look like a scam? Does this not? There is an entire free market industry that is dedicated to detecting fraud. The government, if we take the case of FTX, he was literally meeting with, he met with Gensler, he met with the White House over and over. He was hanging out, he was having face-to-face meetings with the heads of these agencies. You don't just get that if you're nobody, okay? Somebody's got to call somebody to get you that face-to-face meeting with him. So the idea that we, the people, do, right? We, the industry, we were trying to warn about all these scams. We were warning users, don't put your money into this guy, he's a scammer. And the regulators were sitting there whining and dining with this guy. So it should raise suspicion whether the regulators are cleaning it up or are they the ones making it dirty.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, why don't we transition? Another thing that you did recently that I was very interested in was you were talking about the Bank of Japan, some of their pending losses or warnings they're putting out. And so maybe just quickly tell the people what's the news book, and then we'll talk more broadly about these fascinating topics.
Yeah, so yesterday Bank of Japan warned that if rates on the 10-year bond go to 2%, then they're going to have a loss on their books of about $400 billion. And the Japanese economy is much smaller, so if you take that in U.S. terms, it would be something like $1.8 trillion of losses on their books. And the rates up there have been trying very hard to get to 2%. In other words, bonds have been falling, and then the Central Bank of Japan has been moving heaven and earth to try to buy these up in order to stop that. And so that then raises the question: okay, what exactly happens to a country if their central bank is losing money? And that's topical here because our own beloved Federal Reserve is now losing about $2 billion per week, and those losses are just accumulating for them now.
Now that particular figure, is that the mark-to-market loss, a reduction in the asset value, or is that the mismatch in how much they're paying? Like, is that a cash flow loss? Do you know?
I mean, the cash flow. So let's see, they've got it booked at a certain amount. Yeah, this is just for the roll-off. So they've not gone back and I know and marked the market their entire portfolio. If they did, I expect it to be a very, very large number.
Okay. Yeah.
And also, you would expect that to happen all at once.
Yeah, because we covered yeah, right, and interest rates aren't rising every week, so that must be that number. Yeah, because the distinction for listeners, and Jeff and I did cover this back where Cadis came out with a study talking about the Fed's loss. So there's the two-pronged distinction of just their assets get marked down, so if they had to realize it, that would be a loss. But then even, you say, oh yeah, but they're going to hold to maturity, so who cares? But actual cash flow, they're in because they're paying interest, on reserves to the banks, so that's money going out their door, and so then if they're getting less than they because of that. So anyway, that was so. Why should the average American citizen care?
Right. So in a sense, the losses themselves don't matter that much, right? The Fed has a giant money printer in the basement. They can make anything. It's not like they're going to have to shut down and lay off Jerome Powell, however tempting that may be. The main real-world impact is just that the Fed maintains this balance sheet. They've got a bunch of assets and a bunch of liabilities. The liabilities are primarily dollar and its various counterfeit versions. And if that goes negative, in other words, if they're technically bankrupt, then at that point they stop handing profits over to Congress. And those profits are actually pretty large. They're about $100 billion a year before COVID, which is about half of what the corporate income tax takes. So that's the main real-world impact, is simply that sort of free money shuts off the governments, and then they have to find some way to replace that. And the way we're going at the moment, it could be many decades before that money flow goes back to Treasury. But before people say, okay, let's just let it rip. Of course, when we look at the Fed's balance sheet and we look at all their liabilities, in a sense, those are the scalps, or like the deer on the wall, mounted on the wall, for all of the resources that they have counterfeited over the years and that they have seized from the rest of us. So that's not to say necessarily that that it's a good thing when the Fed is running around printing up new money, but it is to say that the harm came from printing the money. The harm is not necessarily whether technically they have greater liabilities than assets.
Okay, why don't we take a minute? You had made a bunch of good points there, but again, I know some listeners, they probably hear these things, but no one's ever fully explained it. So just the piece you sort of offhand remarked, oh yeah, the Fed, I guess the verb they use is remitted, like they remit their profits to the Treasury.
Yeah.
And some people might be surprised to hear, like, well, no, I thought the Fed was this independent thing sitting over here, and its job was to maintain high employment and low price inflation, and that's its dual mandate. What do you mean the Fed's giving money to Congress? How does that work?
Yeah, this was kind of the deal ever since the beginning of modern central banking with the Bank of England. Really, in France, John Law's scam had to work the same way. But generally, the idea is that every central bank in the world, they print up money and then they can lend that money out at interest, and so they make profits every year, right? If you're a counterfeiter and you're lending out your counterfeit money, it would be really shocking if you didn't make profits. You'd be a pretty bad lender at that point. And they hand that money over to government. And so in a sense, you can look at it as the government licenses central banks to be counterfeiters, and in exchange, the central banks give them chunks of money. In the U.S. case, it comes out to about $100 billion a year. But the same pattern is really duplicated all over the world. Bank of England is really kind of, I think, the modern template, and then the Fed ultimately was based on that.
Yeah, and so for listeners, if you get my book on money mechanics from the Mises Institute, it's free. You get the PDF if you want. We'll put a link in the show notes page for this episode. I go through the specifics with the Federal Reserve, so it's where people talk. I'm sure you guys do. People are like, oh, the Fed's privately owned, and it's like yes and no. So yes, the member they are like shareholders. The Federal Reserve does have shareholders that are private entities, so it's not like the Food and Drug Administration. It is kind of a weird thing, and they do get guaranteed. So they had to put in capital to get into the system to become a shareholder, and then they do get the Fed, like you say, in a normal year would have a bunch of profit because they got a printing press. They buy bonds, they earn interest. The Fed has expenses. It's got all the staff economists and stuff cranking out papers saying how great the Fed is. They got the lighting. They got to pay someone to cut the lawn or whatever. But typically they have a bunch of profit. They do distribute dividends to their their shareholders, but it's a fixed number. It's what they give, and then they got a pile usually left over, and they remit that to the Treasury. And like you say, like presumably that's sort of a quid pro quo that the federal government is saying, all right, we're going to give you this privileged position, but in exchange, after you pay yourself a handsome little guaranteed return, you give us the balance. And so that's a nice little scratch my back, I'll scratch your kind of relationship. And so what you're saying, Peter, is among other possible ramifications, one implication of the fact that the Fed is not just suffering a reduction on its asset side, but also, like we said, it's even cash flow negative, I believe, because again, they're paying more in interest to bankers than they're getting in. That they don't have excess earnings right now to be remitting to the Treasury, and in fact, they're like reporting it. It's this weird accounting thing where they have a negative liability to the Treasury, and so it's going to take
which
time
is
to
an asset for them.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that's an asset, believe it or not. That's very cute.
So
yeah.
So among other things, that up till now, so I guess from the taxpayer's perspective, sure, the Fed was printing a bunch of money and making dollars have a diluted purchasing power unless I happen to be a defense contractor or whatever. And then, but on the right side, given the level of government spending and taxation, borrowing was $100 billion less than it otherwise would have been in 2019 or something. Is that kind of what you're saying? Whereas now, something else will have to give because that extra amount coming back is now not showing up.
go up, number two, taxes would go up, and it's inconceivable in this day and age that spending would go down. So that extra 100 billion will have to come out of one of those. And one of the, I think it's good just to mention the private ownership. That gets a lot of attention, I think, online. The private ownership, I don't think is that, it's not such a huge deal. It rankles for sure, right? Because the Fed is supposed to be this disinterested independent agency, but actually if it turns out it's, owned by the banks, that's pretty disgusting. But, I think the vast majority of the damage that the Fed is doing is this printing up of the money supply. And it does that not necessarily because the banks per se tell it to every year. It's kind of designed to work that way, to be sort of a standing bailout to encourage the financial system to grow as quickly as possible. And, as opposed to a free market system where growing as fast as possible would then lend to periodic panics. Once you sort of put those guardrails in and make it absolutely impossible to fail, then yes, the thing can go incredibly fast. They can drive 150 miles per hour all the time. And then we get the situation, we've seen over the past 15 years where, even a light drizzle turns into an existential crisis. I don't know if you remember, Bob, in 2008, comedian Jon Stewart, who was great at one time, he had a rant about the financial system, and he said, they keep saying, this is the perfect storm, this is a once-in-a-century storm, but these things are happening every week. I'm starting to think this is not a perfect storm, this is a regular storm, and we have a shitty boat. And I think, when we talk about SVB, when we talk about Deutsche Bank or Credit Suisse or all these panics going on right now, when you dig into each one individually, they're not that big a deal. Silicon Valley Bank, they didn't have some catastrophic, like the guy siphoned off half the resources and went and bought an island like Sam Bankman-Fried. These are regular storms. Credit Suisse has been badly run for 20 years.